Today, Public Interest Alberta is launching a new campaign called Revenue Reno to encourage a public conversation in the province about the government's revenue shortage and the quality of our public services. The campaign emphasizes Alberta's need to renovate its tax system with changes to personal income tax rates and the introduction of a sales tax to protect and revitalize public services. It's clear that Alberta has a structural shortage of tax revenue, and it is a threat to our healthcare system, to our schools, and to supports for our most vulnerable residents. We all know that massive cuts to public services would hurt all Albertans, both present and future, and the only alternative is to renovate our tax system to raise significantly more revenue. The main points of the Revenue Reno campaign are as follows. First of all, Albertans need public services, and they must be strengthened, not cut. Our provincial government has a revenue shortage that must be fixed to protect and revitalize those public services. Secondly, resource revenues should be saved for future generations, not relied upon to fund government's basic operations. And thirdly, Alberta's revenue shortage is best solved by renovating our tax system with changes to personal income taxes and a sales tax. And now we will show you the feature video of the campaign on the Revenue Reno website.
For too long, Alberta has allowed its financial house to crumble. We've been asleep while stable revenue sources were chipped away. And we've pressed snooze on the fact that we don't even collect enough money to pay for basic things like schools and hospitals anymore. Instead, we've relied on unstable sources of money, like resource royalties, to pay for essential services. That's like hoping for a lottery win to pay your heating bill, or waiting for dear old Uncle George to bail you out of your student loan. Resource royalties are just plain unreliable when it comes to financing the infrastructure and public services Albertans need. That means our public services are constantly at risk of falling apart. So how can we rebuild our public finances? Some people will tell you we need to run deficits. Of course, deficit spending is important in difficult times, but it's not sustainable. And if we don't have our financial house in order, those bills will pile up fast. Others claim we need to cut Alberta's public services to balance the books, but that's like paying your credit card bill by turning off your utilities. When we cut our public services, we move Alberta backward, not forward, and we don't get any closer to responsible revenue management. The only way to fix Alberta's public finances for the long term is to increase provincial revenue from reliable sources. There are several different ways to generate revenue, and Albertans need to talk about responsible taxation. For instance, a 1% income tax increase on all but the lowest income Albertans means an extra $1 billion in revenue. This would cost the average person an extra $8 a week. Sales tax, a fact of life in every other province, is another option to stabilize our public finances. Each percentage point of sales tax could generate up to $1.6 billion of revenue, helping to pay for hospitals and schools with enough doctors, nurses, and teachers for everyone. And sales tax credits for low-income Albertans means the poorest won't be unfairly targeted. It's time for Albertans to understand that we can't rely on the resource revenue windfall anymore. We need fair, responsible taxation, just like every other province. Alberta needs to fix its revenue shortage now, so we can protect and revitalize our public services. And so future generations aren't stuck with a bigger problem. Cutting services or borrowing money aren't sustainable options. It's time for a grown-up conversation about what mix of taxation Alberta needs to fix our revenue shortage. Join the conversation at revenuereno.ca.
Now we'll have Melville McMillan, Professor Emeritus of Economics from the University of Alberta, talk about some of the public finance elements of the campaign. Mel.
All right, I'm here just to provide a little bit of background in terms of what the fiscal situation is in Alberta. And first diagram or figure we have here is that Albertans have become used to a high level of natural resource revenues, which over the first 15 years of this century have been about $3,200 per capita. With the collapse of oil prices in 2015, that has decreased so that we're now experiencing or looking at a level of $888 per capita for the next 5 years. And that's a drop of $2,300 per capita, which is 20% of the provincial government revenue. continuing spending, but with that drop in revenue has resulted in a big fiscal hole for the province. The $10.8 billion deficit, which we hear much about, is the most obvious one, but the problem is actually bigger than that because borrowing is greater than what the deficit is, the borrowing requirements, and we're actually dipping into some of our financial reserves, which means that we're worse off by $13.5 billion in a year. Okay, this diagram shows that we may want to wait and hope for a recovery in natural resource revenues, but natural resource revenues have been quite unreliable. This graph shows the percentage that natural resource revenues contribute towards public services or public expenditures in Alberta, program expenditures. And it goes back to the 1970s when it was very high, low, went up again. But you can see here is 2000, and ever since then it's been downhill. And what we might do is hope that it's going to go up, but that probably is not a very responsible result. And we're looking at projecting into the future relatively low resource revenues. Excuse me. One option is to cut expenditures, but the fiscal gaps that we've talked about are anywhere from 20 to 25% of spending, which means that you're going to have very massive cuts. Here is the level of spending, program spending in the province. It's hard to say where would you want to take out 20 or 25% of expenditures. It's going to hurt Albertans. So the other option is that we might look at the tax gap. This is Alberta, fortunately, has been able to, as a result of the natural resource revenues, have low taxes, and we have taxed from 8.5 to about over $20 billion less than what other provinces do in their fiscal systems. So we could dip into this, and remembering that the resource revenues have collapsed, but the demand for public services has not collapsed, is probably responsible to look at raising the tax revenues of the province to support public services. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Mel. And now I'm going to introduce the other three people that I've got with me today who are going to speak about the perspectives of their organizations when it comes to the fiscal gap, the revenue shortage, and public services. So we're going to have Heather Smith, President of United Nurses of Alberta, Mike Parker, President of Health Sciences Association of Alberta, and Jason Heistad, Executive Secretary Treasurer for the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. So Heather, please.
My remarks will be very brief. I'm one of those Albertans who lived through the Klein years when the approach to having a deficit was to massively slash public sector programs, public programs, notably health and education, but not just notably health and education. It hit every Albertan in many, many ways. And you know, as Mel has put this information up, the belief is that we're not talking about lower revenue from oil and gas for a longer period of time. We're talking about lower forever. And now is the time that we, all Albertans, need to turn our attention to real solutions. We need to find fiscally responsible plans for the resources that we need for our province that does not include diminishing public services or offloading costs, as we saw during the Klein years, which of course increases the burden on all Albertans. As the little video said, it's time for a grown-up conversation and serious conversation about the revenue we need for this province to have strong, sustainable public services for all Albertans.
Thanks, Joel. HSA members are experts in their healthcare field. We represent more than 25,000 professionals working on the front lines, and we need to trust them and we need to listen to them. Our members are saying loud and clear that the healthcare cupboards are bare. We've seen cuts in spending has fallen behind population growth. Inflation every year has been on the rise. We've been trying to do more, care for more people with less and longer term. Healthcare needs sustainable funding. You simply cannot run a modern healthcare system if you're funding on a funding roller coaster, cutting and slashing every time the prices of a barrel of oil drops. If we don't fix Alberta's broken revenue model, that roller coaster ride will continue for years. But that ride's going to get rougher and rougher. If we don't fix Alberta's broken revenue model, we will inevitably be cut to the front lines of care. If you think of the system is struggling now, just wait. It'll get much worse. The bottom line, without revenue reform, patients will suffer, some may die. If you want the ambulance to be there when you call it, if you want the lab test results urgently, if you need cancer treatment now rather than in 6 months, if you need health care now, we need revenue reform now. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Jason Heistad, and I'm the Executive Secretary-Treasurer for the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, which proudly represents over 93,000 working people province-wide. We represent frontline workers in provincial government, services, healthcare, education, and boards and agencies and municipalities. We recently heard in the province's speech from the throne some good news, that Alberta's economy is improving. Frontline public service workers played a major role in providing the support and stability needed to help guide the province through some difficult times recently. And they will continue to be there for Albertans in our communities as the province recovers and grows. However, questions remain on how provincial government intends to generate the adequate revenue needed to provide secure and predictable funding to ensure these services remain strong and healthy for all Albertans. There's nothing compassionate about service cuts, rollbacks, and other austerity measures. There's also nothing responsible about failing to address the revenue side of things. It's unfortunate because short-sighted cuts do nothing to improve the economy and end up hurting families and their communities. In fact, the downturn public sector jobs helped stabilize Alberta's economy. Many families relied on the employment income of public service workers, and so did the local businesses. The steady income of these workers allowed them to continue to spend and support local establishments, which helped keep our economy running. And so, with the province recovering from the recent recession, we're urging the government to resist calls to reduce the deficit through cuts and to do more to bring in the stable, reliable revenue needed to support services Albertans depend on. The reality is, with the workload, health and safety, and other work sites issues and continuing to increase, more investment is sorely needed in the front lines. So in anticipation of the provincial budget on March 22nd, we're hopeful for the current reliance on unpredictable resource revenue, which is not the most effective way to fund vital services. This is recognized, and there's a movement from the province on how we responsibly support these services through stable, predictable revenue, like a more fair and balanced provincial tax structure. That's the conversation we're starting today, and I want to thank Public Interest Alberta for allowing us to be here today. Thank you. Thanks.
All right, thank you all. So to go over a little bit of the campaign has a website at revenuereno.ca, as you heard about in the video. The website also has a series of frequently asked questions to do with public services and tax revenue in the province, and probably most importantly, it's got a tool on it to message your MLA, and we're encouraging Albertans from across the province to use this tool to get in touch with their MLA and to let their politicians know, regardless of political party, that we expect them to take action to solve the revenue shortage so that our public services are protected and revitalized. We'll also be holding a series of public events in 5 cities across the province in April, and in that way encouraging a public conversation with Albertans. So this campaign aims to help Albertans learn more about Alberta's fiscal problem, the dangers it poses to our public services, and the solutions we can use to protect and revitalize those services. We want Albertans to have these conversations with their friends, families, neighbors, and co-workers, so all of Alberta's political parties are expected to tell Albertans what their solution is to the fiscal problem. Will they make massive cuts to our public services? And if so, which ones? And what will the effect be on our classrooms, our hospitals, and our seniors' homes? Or will they fix our revenue shortage to ensure that our valuable public services are not only protected, but made stronger? Our goal with the campaign is to facilitate those discussions by making sure all of the facts are readily available to everybody. Thank you for coming today.